Okay, well, look, I'm going to make a start. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you to our Zoom meeting on behalf of Liberal Voice for Women. We're a special interest group of Liberal Democrat members and supporters aiming to promote the interests of women and girls within our party. We're focusing in these meetings upon topics which we feel the Liberal Democrats need to understand and discuss openly. We feel it is clear that some of the party's current policies are not in the interests of girls and women. Old hands know this already, but for new participants, please put your questions in the chat as we go along, and I'll call on you to ask them at the end. We're recording this event and it will be put on YouTube soon. If you don't want to ask a question yourself, let me know and I can ask it for you. All but two of our events have been recorded and they're available at the LVW channel on YouTube. Subscribe and share them with your friends if you wish. I suggest that you put your Zoom screen on speaker view for the best view of the discussion and mute yourself to get ready to hear eloquent advocates of women's rights in Scotland. Now let me introduce you to our guests. Professor Sarah Pedersen was our inaugural speaker last year, talking about her excellent book, The Politicisation of Mumsnet, and she set the tone for succeeding events. She is Professor of Communication and Media at Robert Gordon University, Aberdeen. Her research interests include Scottish police and Scottish women's domestic violence charities. Her recent papers are They've Got an Absolute Army of Women behind them, the formation of a women's cooperative constellation in contemporary Scotland. It's absolutely fabulous, and there's a link to it on our chat, and we'll put successive links again as we go along. And her other article is It's What the Suffragettes Would Have Wanted, the construction of the suffragists and suffragettes on Mumsnet, and the link to that again will go on. They're both free to download, so you shouldn't have any problem reading them, and they're well worth reading. Sarah tells me that she's recently been made sex equality champion to Robert Gordon University. So it sounds as though Robert Gordon's is bucking the trend in changing everything to gender. That's great. And you can follow her on Twitter at Sarah Pedersen 2, not the ordinary one, at Sarah Pedersen 2. Susan Smith is here in the grassroots women's group for Women Scotland. Yeah. Susan is responsible for press and media releases and has a background in finance. She also makes submissions to policy bodies. Can you mute, please, everybody? Yeah. You can follow her on @ForWomenScot. So, Sarah, your research was funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. It suggests that women's history and experience are valuable at that level.
Your sound on the side, is it?
Can you mute, please, listeners? Yeah, it suggests that women's history and experience are valued at the level of the Royal Society of Edinburgh. Now, can you give us an account of Got an Absolute Army of Women behind them?
Yes, thanks, Alison, and thanks very much for inviting me. I'm just going to run quickly through some of my findings from this particular research project. Can the people from Scotland, because I can see there's some Scots there, so you might need to bear with me if I explain some basic things to the entire audience. But yes, I really acknowledge the fact that my research into a women's cooperative constellation around gender critical views in Scotland was funded by the Royal Society of Edinburgh. You will understand that it is not easy to get research funding for gender critical research. So I'm really pleased that the RSE funded this. I talk about what I call a women's cooperative constellation. What do I mean by that? Well, if you go back to the 1990s and 2000s, first of all, in Norway, and then in the EU as a whole, you get these groups of feminists coming together to try and achieve feminist goals. First of all, in the Norwegian parliament, and then in the EU as a whole. And they're groups that have come together not because they all belong to the same political parties, because they don't. They are women from academia, there are some politicians, there are policy experts, there are journalists, and they all come together in what we call these cooperative constellations to work together to actually achieve their goals. So the politicians know how to get things through parliaments, and the policy experts and the academics can give them really good ideas and theories to support them. And then they also bring the activists and the journalists to provide evidence. And they all work together, and because they work together, they were able to achieve things. So what I argue is that we have a cooperative constellation that has grown up in Scotland around these sort of questions to do with the Gender Recognition Act and its possible reform. So we have politicians, and I expect you can immediately think of people like Joanna Cherry, Joanne Lamont, Joan McAlpine, who've come together despite the fact that they are from different political parties, and in fact also crossing a line that is rarely crossed in Scottish politics between unionist and independence voters. So they come together, but with policy experts, and I've got to, of course, acknowledge Mackenzie Murray Blackburn there, MBM. They come together with journalists and columnists. They come together with academics, perhaps like myself, and also lots and lots of activists, including, of course, Susan and For Women Scotland. And they're working together in order to raise awareness of concerns about the proposed reform, and also to try and take the debate off social media and into, Holyrood itself, into the mainstream media. So I was given some funding last year, and I did 18 interviews with these women who identified as being part of this cooperative constellation, which I have to say was quite sort of an emotional thing for all of us. This was at the height of the pandemic, so all of my interviews were via Zoom, and I was asking women about how they got involved in this debate in the first place and what the consequences for them had been. And I have to say that they got very emotional when they talked about some of the things that had happened to them: the rape threats, the death threats, the loss of friends, the loss of opportunities, the impact on their career. It was a really emotional conversation that we were having. They told me about how they had got involved in the debate in the first place. And what was really obvious, there were two obvious things. One was that for the most part, they did not hear about this from the mainstream media. They heard about it from social media. Now, whether that was Twitter or Mumsnet, because it wasn't being covered. And this was the journalists as well were saying to me, it wasn't being covered at this time. So to give you a bit of context as far as sort of the Scottish the element of this, you will know that in 2018, the UK government ran a consultation on how best to reform the GRA. So because the GRA is part of what we call the devolved matters, the Scottish government also ran a public consultation at the same time. And its consultation covered topics such as the minimum age for which applications for gender recognition could be made, with the possibility that it could be reduced to 16. So they had over 15,000 responses received for that. And then in December of 2019, they launched a second consultation, and they received a whopping 17,000 responses to that second consultation. Now, we're not sure what the second consultation actually said in full detail. In September last year, they published an analysis of responses as far as organizations were concerned. And this reported that 4 in 10 organizations did not support changes to a system based on self-ID. 1 in 10 did not take a view at all, or their view wasn't clear, and 5 in 10 were in support. So you can see it's basically 50-50 here about whether or not self-ID should be brought in. But as far as the much, much larger number of individual responses, nearly 17,000 individual responses, this report didn't actually give a breakdown, which is interesting in itself. And then in August 2021, the SNP and the Scottish Green Party published its draft share programme, which states that the government is going to bring in a bill to reform the GRA, which is where we are at the moment. And Susan's going to be talking a bit more about that in a minute. Okay, so back to this constellation of women who find out about what's going on, normally around 2015, something like that. They're seeing it on social media. And what they tell me is that their involvement in this is part of what they see as their feminist journey. You know, these are women, when I ask them, you know, why did you get involved? I'm getting these long stories about Greenham Common and Reclaim the Night and going on marches and being involved in domestic violence charities and their jobs being involved with working with women and children. So they didn't see this as one issue. And I think that's really important. They saw this as part of their history, their whole biography of being involved with campaigning for women, with being concerned about what's going on with women. So that's how they've been drawn into this. And then, well, they started to be alarmed. They started to want to talk to people about this, but there was a real fear. There was a real fear, well, who do I talk to about this? Because I could get into trouble. And several people told me that they'd gone on social media and they'd gone on their trade union sites. And they'd said, you know, I'm really concerned about this. I'm left wing, I'm a trade unionist, read The Guardian, support the BBC. I will go to these places and I will share my concerns with like-minded people. And when they did that, the backlash was instant, and it was to tell them that they were basically evil TERFs, evil transphobes. And they were really horrified by this. You know, again and again, I was told, you know, I thought these were my people. I thought they would understand. I thought we could have a nuanced debate, acknowledging that there were issues on both sides and try and come together. And instead, I was thrown out of the group. I was banned. I was, you know, immediately told that I was wrong and I had to be, you know, re-educated. So how did they find like-minded people? Well, it was like codes, that people were using codes, whether it was pictures of suffragettes or, you know, names that might hint at a gender critical identity. Or they went on Mumsnet, where you can speak about these things in anonymity, and they were able to share their concerns there. And little by little, they built up a group of people they could talk to. And one of the things that people were telling me about social media wasn't so much I posted about this. It was the way in which they could use social media for what I call back-channeled chat, so that they could talk to people through direct messaging on Twitter. They could talk to people in little private groups on Facebook. They could be anonymous on Mumsnet and so share their views without being denounced by work colleagues. So it's like some sort of secret sort of, as though we're in the Soviet Union or something, and everybody's using codes and using images of the suffragettes and of course now dinosaurs in order to communicate. So when does it break big in Scotland? Well, a lot of people identified the 2019 tweet of the year. So Holyrood magazine, which is a magazine published basically for anybody who's interested in Scottish politics, it awarded the tweet of the year to the MSP Joan McAlpine. So Joan McAlpine had been the chair of a parliamentary committee that has scrutinised the census bill. And in 2019, she did this very long series of tweets talking about her concerns about the use of gender rather than sex in the Scottish census. And for those of you who don't know, the Scottish census was a year later. We are doing the Scottish census as I speak. and with all the controversy that has brought about. So she sort of wrote these tweets saying that she's really concerned that biological sex, which was needed to be monitored for things like planning health services, was being ignored. And all hell broke loose, really. And we start then to get coverage in the mainstream media. We start to get it discussed in the Scottish Parliament, and this was a really important moment for these women. So how does the Constellation act? What do they do? Well, one of the things they do is they work to raise awareness, both on social media and, more importantly, in the streets and in Holyrood. So women like Susan, and I've talked about the feminist policy collective Murray Blackburn Mackenzie, they use social media to raise awareness of concerns that women have about the proposed reforms. But this means that they establish themselves as authorities. And that means then that when the mainstream media is looking to cover this, then they come and they talk to these women. How else is the Constellation acting? Well, it demonstrates support for people who are being attacked. So whether that's Joanna Cherry, or as it was, Joan McAlpine, Joanne Lamont, J.K. Rowling, all of these people get support from the Constellation. They sort of all come together, as the title of the piece says, an army is there to support them. And that's particularly important when there are people, when things are happening in Holyrood. So one of the big set pieces that happened in Holyrood was in relation to what's called the Forensic Medical Services Bill. Now, the Forensic Medical Services Bill was a great idea. What it said was that there was a real appreciation that some women who had been sexually attacked, weren't coming forward because it meant the only way in which you could get evidence taken was if you went to the police, and a lot of women weren't necessarily up for doing that right at the beginning. And so how could evidence be collected? So the idea was that women could go directly to forensic medical services. Now, there was a particular part of the bill that said that women should be allowed to ask for a medical examiner of their own gender. And the MSP, Scottish Labour MSP, Joanne Lamont, put in a motion asking for the replacement of the word gender. So it was 6 words that her motion was: for the word gender, substitute sex. And what we get is a hashtag raising the profile of the debate outside Holyrood. So this hashtag ran during that week. It was just hashtag 6 words. And it was the most amazing hashtag to read because A, it was supporting Joanne Lamont, but B, what it did was it allowed women to talk about their own experiences of assault, their own experiences of rape, and how they had to endure such examinations. So it provided some really powerful supplementary evidence, as so many women spoke out online about their own lived experience. And one of the quotes, which was from one of the politicians that I interviewed, said, "It was really powerful. It makes you realize you're not alone." And this was women standing up in Holyrood trying to argue for this motion, and they could almost see the groundswell of support out with Holyrood through this 6 words hashtag. And what happened was that finally the government gave way and voted for the amendment, because they could see there was such a powerful demand in the country for this amendment. Which leads me on to one of the other findings, which was the despair with which the established women's organisations were perceived by the constellation, by all of my interviewees. One of the things that happened during the 6 words is that Rape Crisis Scotland argued in support of the use of gender rather than sex, and argued vociferously on social media that women's lived experiences should be ignored, and finally announced that it had been driven off social media by harassment, by hatred. So all of my interviewees were really disappointed and very critical of the established women's organisations, Rape Crisis Scotland, Scottish Women's Aid, Zero Tolerance, which is a Scottish organisation, and Engender. And what they were saying was that they felt that these organisations were far too closely linked to the government. Basically, these organisations get the vast majority of their funding from the Scottish government. And so perhaps it's not surprising that they are likely to support what the government wants to do. So there was a real anger that, you know, their support for the Scottish government was being driven by fears of funding being cut, and therefore, you know, they are scared that they will become targets of cuts, and therefore that, you know, their opinions were being driven by this need for funding from the government. And so, you know, what I basically summarize at the end of this article, which, you know, is freely available, so please go and read it, is the interviews were pointing a finger of blame at the Scottish government. They thought that plans for the reform of the Gender Recognition Act had not been completely thought through. And that means that 2 different and vulnerable groups are now duking it out, basically on social media. That the constellation contains all these incredibly capable women, very politicized, enormous energy, great appetite for working collaboratively and strategically. And yet this energy, this amazing organizational energy, and everybody's giving up their you know, their time and their resources for free, that's not currently being utilized either by the government in Scotland or by the established women's organisations, and is also being ignored by the vast majority of political parties in Scotland, which, you know, in my opinion, is an enormous shame. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, that was a fabulous run through of the paper. I can tell everybody that it's a really good paper, and, you know, it's well worth reading. And you have only touched the top really of it, but there's so much wealth of information and research in there. It's really well worth reading. I'm hoping that we'll come back in a little bit and maybe have a look at your other paper about is what the suffragettes would have wanted. But now I want to turn to Susan Smith, because Susan, you've heard this. I'm guessing that you're not one of the, for Women Scotland is not one of the organisations that gets any funding from the government.
No, not as yet, although we've taken them to court, so and we won, and they have to pay us costs. So in the future, we are now going to be able to say that we have been funded by the Scottish government, albeit desperately reluctantly. And that particular case was a bit of a, it should be a cautionary tale for Scottish government. I don't know if they will take it as a cautionary tale, because they are quite determined to press on regardless. But this was about a lesser known piece of legislation, the Gender Representation on Public Boards Act, which passed in 2018. And it was a bit of a lesson in how this ideology has been allowed into politics and into legislation, because when this was introduced, and again, it had a pretty worthy aim, it was to have gender balance on public boards, 50-50 male-female. And it said in the event of a tie, they were to consider the sex of the applicant. Well, they didn't say sex. They talked about men and women. And in the original draft, they left it as women. And the presumption was that this would reflect the definition of women in the Equality Act, which of course is a female of any age. And it was brought as a piece of positive action, which is allowed by the Equality Act. During the committee stages, James Morton of Scottish Trans Alliance argued pretty forcibly that this was not an appropriate definition of woman. And as a consequence, the definition was amended in the guidance to say that this was anyone who identified as a woman and excluded people who were female who might not identify as women. And at the time it passed without anybody noticing, including some of the amazing parliamentarians who subsequently stepped up, because this is how, if you've ever read the Denton's report, which was a bit of a how-to guide, and it was about latching these things onto other bits of legislation and slipping them in under the radar. And this was a classic example of that. It was slipped in under the radar. It passed without much opposition. The Conservatives voted against it, but they voted against it for reasons other than the definition of woman, just because they didn't particularly want the positive action measure. And so by the time this had become law, there were a lot of women in Scotland who were newly energised by the GRA debate, but who had not been in a position to object to this. And at the time when James Morton was arguing for this definition, the committee, the Parliament, James Morton, etc., said this would not set a precedent. By the time I went to that census committee at the end of 2018, Tim Hopkins was in there arguing this was the definition adopted in that piece of legislation, so therefore this should be the definition adopted in subsequent pieces of legislation. So it was very easy to see how this was going to be rolled forward. We saw an opening when there was a consultation launched about the implementation of it, because it didn't actually become law until 2020. So at that point we thought, right, maybe we can take this on. We were in a better position to take it on. We took it to judicial review. We lost the judicial review, which was, that was one of those moments. I think of it as a sort of 3-act play where you have this moment of complete despair at the end of the second act, and you're poised at the edge of this precipice, and there's a crisis rolling in on you. And we decided we were going to be brave, because our lawyers said this judgment is flawed. So we took it to appeal, and the highest court in Scotland said that it was a misreading of the Equality Act on the part of the Scottish Government, that they could not redefine protected characteristics in the Equality Act, that if they were going to do positive action for women, they could not include biological males. So we're really pleased about this, because this is probably the highest example now we have of case law relating to the definition of sex in the Equality Act, and it's a big deal. And it will be a big deal because going forward, the Scottish Government is determined to press on with all the things that in the UK government has kicked into the long grass: DRA reform, REMAT conversion therapy for trans children. All these things are still very, very much live, and so we are going to need some of this legal backing going forward. And I think it may come to it that ultimately we have to bring another case if the GRA goes through as planned, because if the GRA goes through as currently laid out in the draft bill, it's going to cause the same sort of problems with the Equality Act. The GRA is devolved, the Equality Act is reserved, and we cannot see that there will not be cross-border implications between these two pieces of legislation rubbing up against each other. So that was where we are with that. And as I say, going forward now, we have the committee stage of the GRA. We don't know how that is going to go. There's a call for evidence, but we are still formulating how we think best to respond to that, because they are trying to limit how people respond to it. The call for evidence is different from consultation. We think they are going to have an expedited process on this, that they want to push it through really fast. Certainly the Greens want it pushed through really, really fast, in a way that is not typical. So it will be very interesting to watch it, and it will be very interesting. We were talking earlier and about Lorna Slater's intervention in the Herald this weekend, and she has made some pretty inflammatory comments. She's a minister in the Scottish government. She has responsibilities under the Nolan principles. She has just come out and said that people who disagree with the government shouldn't be allowed on the television, that we're all funded by fascists in America or something. And it's utterly outrageous. It is completely outrageous that the Scottish government are allowing ministers to speak like this about people who are opposed to them. I don't know what that's going to do to the level of debate within Parliament when this comes to Parliament, because I do not know how MSPs who have doubts or concerns about this will feel confident about speaking out. Maggie Chapman, who is another Green, is the co-convener of the committee who is looking at this, and has already said that she will be openly hostile to people. So the calls from Shona Robertson when introducing the bill for a respectful debate have already been ignored by members of the Scottish government, and that is very concerning.
I note from one of our audience has remarked that the cost of the JR were doubled by the intervention of Scottish Trans Alliance.
I don't think it quite doubled. I mean, it did double because we had to take it to appeal. But yeah, Scottish Trans Alliance, who are fully funded by the government, they're a project. They were separately funded by Scottish government, but now it's rolled into the Equality Network funding. They're a project Equality Network, and between them they get about £500,000 per annum from the Scottish government. And this is one of the issues, sorry, it's a slight tangent, but this is one of the issues with Scottish government and the groups who advise them, that there is this perception of independence because they talk about we are listening to these groups, but these groups are all fully funded. So in some ways they are acting as extensions of the government. They are not independent. And FOIs, if you ever have cause to seek out FOIs on correspondence between civil servants and the Equality Network, are fascinating because they are very chummy and they are saying, what should we do about this? What should our response be when we're asked about this? And it's completely inappropriate. But so Scottish Trans Alliance came in as interveners in the initial JR, and they used lawyers who act pro bono, and they are funded pro bono by the Scottish government. So taxpayers paid quite a lot of money for our case, ultimately.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I've got a question already. Could Lorna Slater be sued for defamation? Of course, defamation lawsuits are quite expensive.
They are, and you know, she was wise enough not to actually name names. I would imagine at some point one of the Greens are going to do that because they've been desperate to do it for a very long time. Patrick Harvey has made some outrageous comments. I mean, Sarah spoke about the 6 words debate. He has levelled all sorts of comments towards Joanne Lamond and during the hate crime. He was calling the Labour women transphobic, and he used you know, hate groups who've been allowed to speak at Parliament without naming names. John Finney, another Green, referred to organisations as terrorist organisations. I mean, these are people using deliberately incendiary language, which is wholly inappropriate. And at some point, I'm pretty sure one of them will decide they're going to make specific allegations, and that will be very interesting because some of their councillors are almost already down. I mean, Lorna Slater talked about the gentle and hardworking women, by which she meant some of the trans women, say male, who are standing as candidates, and said they were gentle and hardworking. Well, some of them have been putting up cartoons and things like that.
We're having a little bit of difficulty. I'm just wondering whether we
the threats in one way.
shall we ask the audience just to turn off their cameras for a bit, and that might help us with the bandwidth. Okay, if you don't mind, people, that would be helpful. Yeah, you were saying that some of the candidates have been saying what exactly?
Some of the candidates have been have behaved in an inappropriate fashion. One of them is a candidate who was previously a candidate for Labour and was actually threatened with suspension from Labour because of comments made about our group and told to take down posts and apologise. So subsequently defected to the Green Party and then put the post back up and made the comments again, and of course they don't care.
The Green Party has history here. Those of you who remember a couple of years ago when Andy Whiteman, who was a very well-respected MSP and a member of the Scottish Greens Party and a big expert on land reform, acknowledged experts throughout the Scottish Parliament, he resigned because he felt so much pressure on him from Patrick Harvey and other members of the Scottish Green Party that he had come to a meeting at Edinburgh University to hear academics talk about GRA reform and concerns about it. I was one of the people speaking. Julie Bindel was another speaker who was attacked as she left the meeting. And, you know, he sort of said how much he's enjoyed coming to the event, and it was important for parliamentarians to go and hear about women's concerns, and then kind of within 24 hours had put out a statement saying he backtracked, and of course he should never have gone to listen to us. And then during the Forensic Services Bill makes this rather extraordinary speech where, you know, it's a very, very good speech about, you know, the amendment and how good it should be, and then right at the end said, but I won't be voting for it because of the pressure that had been put on him by his own party, and then, you know, then just resigned because he couldn't take it. And Holyrood loses a very, very good MSP.
Gosh, so why is the Scottish Government taking this line of pushing forward this sort of legislation rather than the Nordic model that's been on their policy platform for some time?
I think that's a really, really good and important question. And I think it's partly because Westminster's not doing it. There's always been this thing that Scotland has to be different, especially when you've got an SNP government, and Nicola Sturgeon is absolutely determined to be more progressive than Westminster. There's a history with the SNP. They are not a particularly progressive party, and Scotland was late on a lot of things, especially, you know, it was late on decriminalising homosexuality. It was later than Westminster on equal marriage. So Nicola Sturgeon is, I think, seeing something where she might look more progressive. She has done very little in her time in office. You know, Alex Salmond brought his party, for better or worse, to the referendum and to the brink of independence. She has sat on that for the last few years. She has not done a great deal. So this, I think, represents her a chance to do something differently. We agree with the Nordic model. We would like to see the Nordic model in place. We have been concerned that the Scottish Government appear now to be slightly rolling back on that, and that it may again be due to the same influences that are pushing GRA reform, because the same people who are in favour of GRA reform also seem to be the people who are very pro-prostitution and want full decriminalisation. And the Greens seem to be full of people who are demanding that. But so more concerningly are some of the, what we would call the professional women's organisations, the funded women's organisations. And previously they were not, they were opposed to decriminalisation. They did see prostitution as violence against women. But because we get, and they didn't believe this for a long time, but because we get a lot of information from people who are working on the front line, we found out that Marcia Scott of Scottish Women's Aid had been writing to the independent local centres and recommending the Amnesty report on prostitution, which is, I think, if anybody's read it, it is pretty extreme and was influenced by the pimping lobby. And our understanding is that Engender have now employed one of the co-authors of that report as their new CEO. So yeah, there are women working very, very hard within the Scottish Parliament to work on this, to see prostitution rightly as violence against women. And I am really concerned now that from the top, the people who are around Nicola Sturgeon are not going to be willing to take this forward.
There also seems to be a generational divide in the SNP. The SNP is an incredibly broad church, and you have people who you know are more right wing than others. But the youth wing of the SNP is very pro these progressive policies, and Nicola Sturgeon's power base is based on that younger generation. Whereas the older generation perhaps is still thinking about Alex Salmond, but also is clustering around people like Joanna Cherry. So the GRA reform is very much part of this generational schism, and is really ripping the SNP apart. You know, you have a lot of SNP members who are very focused on independence, and it really is the only thing that they all agree on. And of course, now you do have new parties, whether it's ISP or ALBA, who are also offering independence. So we've got people standing in the council elections from those parties, and it's going to be really interesting to see how they do next month, and whether or not people will vote sort of for independence, but not necessarily for the SNP, because certainly you've got ALBA, for example, coming out and specifically saying that they are against GRA reform. So that, you know, having said that, so is other Scottish Conservatives. They are making a big play for women's votes.
So what you're saying is there's an alternative place for independent voters to go to, not the SNP, in ALBA and ISP?
Potentially. I'm not going to make a big thing of it, but potentially. And I've seen someone commenting that, you know, they disagree with the age divide, and I think you're absolutely right, the point that you've made there, that women who are more secure are more able to speak out. And what that was one of the findings that I found in my research, woman after woman telling me that they had actually waited until they retired before they were able to speak publicly about this, that they felt that they couldn't do it until they retired, and it was in particular younger women. I had to promise the most anonymity to people that I've ever promised in my life with a research project, and the younger people in particular were really concerned that I would in any way identify who they were when I was writing up my findings.
We've got a couple of comments already about being politically homeless and possibly not voting. Can you, Sarah, talk a little bit about what you found in terms of the Mumsnet?
Yeah, I sort of have written a little bit about the use of the term politically homeless on Mumsnet. What I found was fascinating is that that term really isn't used on Mumsnet until the recent years. And it suddenly exploded, women defining themselves as politically homeless. And then you also on Twitter have politically homeless and all these hashtags, Labour losing women, SNP losing women, etc., etc. So many women defining themselves now as politically homeless and really really anguished, because these are women who are incredibly politically involved. They've always voted. Not only have they voted, but they've also, you know, gone around knocking on doors, stuffing envelopes, etc., etc. So they've been really engaged in the political process, and for the most part for centre and left-wing parties. And now they are incredibly worried about, well, how can I vote? So you either have women talking about, well, I'm going to go and I'm going to spoil my ballot, or they are considering voting for parties that they've never voted before, or they are talking about just not going, not voting, because they simply cannot find anybody. And I describe this with my tongue in cheek. They also are talking about cherry picking, not necessarily Joanna cherry picking, but actually looking very, very carefully in these council elections at every single candidate and asking where do they stand on GRA reform, and then making the decision to vote in that particular way. So perhaps voting for candidates that they would never have considered voting for before. So obviously that's not just a Scottish thing, that's UK wide.
Absolutely. But certainly your research here, which is again another really interesting paper, makes the point, doesn't it, that there's so many women who used to be the people who did the canvassing, who used to stuff the envelopes. They're no longer prepared to do that for their previous parties.
Yeah. And I think, sorry, so I think that is where the political parties are being very foolish, because we've spoken about, you know, the impact to date from Alaba has been very tiny, and I don't think it's going to be massive at this council election. What I think it will have an impact on is the long term, because as Sarah said, Nicola Sturgeon has found this constituency of younger people within the party, but they tend not to be the seasoned activists. And the seasoned activists, the kind of people who would be following Alex Salmond or Jim Sellers and some of the other former big names of the SNP, have been put off. And they are the people who are the campaign managers. They were going around knocking on doors, they were stuffing envelopes. And a lot of them are the people who've defected to Alaba. Now that might, as I say, it might not have any impact for a while now, but it will certainly have an impact going forward for the SNP if they have lost their traditional base, because that is effectively what happened to the Labour Party in Scotland, that they lost a lot of these people a few years back and they defected to the SNP, and we've seen what happened to Scottish Labour.
Yeah. So obviously there's a threshold, isn't there, where the level of support that people can organise is at risk if they can't get the people to do the organising.
I mean, I think it's much more.
There are councillor candidates at the moment. Some of the councillors have been elected unopposed because people aren't engaged.
Elected unopposed.
Yeah.
Wow. That's
I think that there's a fundamental question. It's not just about these council elections or about the future of the SNP, but I think there's a much more fundamental question about the way in which people are being turned off politics, particularly women. And it does worry me that women just aren't being able to vote. They because they're so politically homeless, they just stop voting, and therefore they stop being engaged in that way. And that, I think that should be something that all political parties are concerned about.
Yeah, and if I can just go back to Susan, you were talking about these bodies and the civil servants. Do you think that they're actually being encouraged to break the law?
I don't know if I'd want to go that, but I would say there is a huge issue about impartiality, and I do know that some of the practices we've seen recently are sharp or incompetent. I don't know which one, but for example, the SNP manifesto had said that they would reform the GRA. They didn't make any specific promises. They subsequently claimed self-ID was in there, it wasn't. They claimed they would reform it and they would engage with groups, including women's organisations. And quite recently, FOIs found out that, of course, they hadn't consulted with anyone beyond the usual group of funded lobbyists. And it was Stonewall, Equality Network, LGBT Youth, and one other. So we all wrote to the minister and suggested that she needed to make good on this promise and engage with her. And there was a series of hastily arranged meetings at the beginning of this year. But what we subsequently found out was that some of those meetings actually happened after the bill had been lodged with the presiding officer. So although the minister and the civil servants were telling us that there was room for us to influence the bill, this wasn't true because the bill was already lodged. And no changes were made, and we had very, very brief meetings. What was also frightening was the level of ignorance about some of the issues raised. So, for example, Fair Play for Women had spoken about the cross-border impact and about Scottish GRCs being recognised in the rest of the UK. And the civil servant responded with, well, that's the case for Irish GRCs. It's not the case for Irish GRCs. Irish GRCs are not valid anywhere in the UK. So the fact that they failed to understand these very fundamental points was terrifying. They also continued to rely on 3 documents in the evidence, which they'd been called up on way back in 2019. One of them, a paper that likened male bodies in an intimate space, a changing room or a refuge, to a woman who'd had a mastectomy. So this was hugely offensive. It was considered hugely offensive at the time. Questions were asked of the then Cabinet Secretary Shelley-Ann Somerville by Jane McAlpine. She was forced to apologise for including this horrible document, and it's still in there. So, you know, the level of contempt, I think, that the civil servants and the government are showing to people who've already pointed out failings. The other 2 documents, one likened women wanting single-sex space to racists in segregated southern states of America, and the other one, they actually got the conclusions of it completely wrong. So I don't think they'd even read it. It was quite astonishing.
That is
So yes, there's a level of incompetence, if nothing else.
I remember there was a survey, I'm not sure what was it, for Women in Scotland survey, that showed that Conservative and Liberal Democrat supporters are the least likely to support gender recognition reform. Do you have any insights as to why the elected members appear to be ignoring the voters?
Yes, I mean, obviously the Conservatives have woken up to this, and they see a great big open goal. Labour's tussling, and there are people within Labour, but yes, the support amongst Lib Dem voters for self-ID is extremely low, and that doesn't strike me as surprising. I think one of the issues is probably that smaller parties are more liable to capture, and obviously the Green Party has been completely captured. But I think to an extent it's probably been true within the Lib Dems as well. And you will probably know the people that I am thinking of when I think about the individuals who have been pushing this. They are very vocal. They're very vocal on social media. I think they're very vocal within Lib Dem groups, and they are bullies, and they do not act within the traditions within liberal traditions. They act completely contrary to that. But I think that probably the issue in Scotland is that someone like Alex Cole-Hamilton has really nailed his colours to this mast, and he would find it very hard to back down. It is probably a very, very stupid position for him to have taken, because it will not go well in the long run. And what happened with the 6 Words Amendment, which is again another cautionary tale, is that there was enough pressure. I don't think this will happen with the GRA. I think the GRA will pass, but there was enough pressure put upon the SNP for enough of their MSPs to say they would revolt. And this never happens within the SNP. They are, for all that they're a broad church, they're incredibly well whipped. But enough of them were threatening to embarrass the government, including, I believe, members of the cabinet. So that's when they stepped back and rolled over. And so they left the Greens and the Lib Dems as the only people standing there voting to say that rape victims couldn't have a female examiner. And it was horrible optics. It was absolutely awful optics because it was few enough MSPs for some people to have all their pictures up saying these are the MSPs who don't think rape victims deserve care from a woman. So it could, something like that could happen again, and it's going to be particularly damaging for the Lib Dems. The Greens are voted for by enough people who genuinely believe in this stuff. I don't think the Lib Dems are.
Hopefully, is the Respect Our Sex movement active in Scotland?
Yes, I mean we actually, that was actually our slogan that we came up with last year for the election, the Scottish Government elections. So it's now going forward with another life. But yes, I mean I think we've put out a newsletter tonight. You can sign up for our newsletter on our website, and we are asking people to write to their local papers as well, because local papers always want stories, they always want letters, and just write letters to the local papers and say, ask candidates this question. Just ask them, what is a woman? What is a woman? And keep asking them that, because I think, we've seen what happens when national politicians get asked, what is a woman? So yes, we are going to be, we've been sending out leaflets over the weekend. We'll no doubt be sending out more, so hopefully they should be landing quite soon as well. And the local women's groups are amazing on stalls.
Yeah, I mean that's one thing that we've really seen sort of post-pandemic, and with the weather getting slightly better, she says, looking at the forecast, but slightly better, we've seen this real movement onto the streets by all of these groups throughout the country, and they really are the length and breadth of Scotland. We've got, and I'm sure that the rest of the UK as well, but groups going out there on Saturdays and Sundays, even if it's rainy or very windy, and they've got they're handing out the leaflets, and they've got their stall using the suffragette colours, and they've normally got a blow up dinosaur as well, because that always attracts attention, and thank goodness David Lammy made that comment. And wherever you go in the country as well, you've got, the suffragette ribbons tied, and you've got the slates. And we also have a group called Soul Sisters that sort of are doing this demonstration with all these shoes to demonstrate that women are walking away with their feet. They're leaving the SNP, etc. So you've got all of these fantastic small groups really demonstrating that this is a concern that's felt throughout the country. It's not just in the Central Belt, it's not just from people who are very heavily involved in politics. So, I remember last summer going for a walk, and I live very far out in Aberdeenshire, and going for a walk and going up this sort of hill, and at the top of the hill there was some barbed wire and a suffragette ribbon tied to it, and you immediately go, oh wow, somebody like me is here somewhere.
That's excellent. I mean, a lot of these things, they're real activist, grassroots activities, aren't they?
Yes, absolutely, yeah. But demonstrating collective action, and I think that's really important when we talk about feminism. We're talking about collective action, and this is the way in which women are demonstrating that it's not just individuals who are concerned about this, but it is a collective force.
Yes, and so there's the souls, there's the footsteps. I think we saw outside the Scottish Parliament lots of pairs of shoes. That was a fantastic image, wasn't it? And those sort of things. And there have been ribbons, as you say, put all sorts of places. Are people complaining about these? Are the opposition complaining?
Oh, well, yes. I mean, because suffragette ribbons are seen as being threatening, as we know.
Yeah.
Yes, there was an incredible story sometime last year during lockdown, and one of the ministers put up a big post complaining that her office had been vandalised and it was awful for her staff who came in. And there was a slate outside, and then there were these railings, bike railings, and somebody had tied some ribbons to them. And she was wailing about potential hate crime and all these people saying how awful this was and did she need support. But actually then it almost becomes ridiculous. People see that and they think, that's ridiculous. People have tied ribbons and left you a slate. That has to be the most polite form of protest we've ever seen at MSP's office, especially when you consider what was happening during the referendum, which some of the same MSPs who are now complaining about slates and ribbons were quite happy for some pretty horrible things. And, you know, I always think, especially the appalling things that happened to Charles Kennedy, which the SNP never managed to get around to condemning. And now they're apparently horrified if someone ties a ribbon around the door of their office.
We've got a question here. I'm going to ask it for the person asking, for reasons which will become obvious. This person has a call scheduled with a government minister next week, arranged with a clear agenda that has to be constituency-related discussion. Can you, either of you or both of you, offer any guidance? What best to say? How best to deal with it?
I think that the important thing is to try to find something within the constituency that has been a problem. So if there is anything where you know that a local gym or something like that has potentially opened up their space to, you know, I'm thinking of Glasgow Life when they had the guidance about anybody who wanted to go into women's changing rooms could be allowed to do that, and if women objected, that they could be reported for a hate crime. There's also something about the schools, you know, if you've had a school where the toilets have become mixed sex. So yeah, try to find something local, but also, I mean, even if they're a government minister, you should be able to raise concerns about GRA more generally, because a government minister has a responsibility to their constituents in any event on something that they're voting for that's going to affect the whole country. So I don't think you need to avoid it. I know what they will say. They will throw everything back onto the response. Oh, well, that's the responsibility of the gym. That's the responsibility of the local authority. And I think what we have said to people is that at some point, government ministers are going to have to look people in the eye and say, so who makes these decisions? Who says that that person cannot come into a female ward? Is it going to be somebody or into a gym? Is it going to be the underpaid woman on the reception who has to make that decision? And why are you, as a government, not prepared to say where your boundaries would be, whether you would be happy with this? Because if you're not prepared to do it, how on earth can we expect these women who are trying to access, especially rape crisis support or domestic refuge, how are they to take on that responsibility if government will not and MSPs will not?
Yeah, and one of the other things to be talking about is the other protected characteristics. So if, you know, you're talking about a Muslim woman or a Jewish woman, for example, wanting to go to perhaps a female-only swimming session, then that's a really good thing to be talking about as well. But one of the things to emphasize, and one of the things that came out of my research, was that politicians said that they are most affected not by what they hear on social media, but by individuals contacting them, letters to them really are important. They will respond, but they are aware. So you often hear politicians saying, oh yes, this is in my mailbag. This is something that's really, people are writing letters to me about. So it's really important to be using that sort of way of connecting with politicians, by writing to them, by contacting them at their constituency office, not just hoping that you can get the message over on social media, because it's very easy for them to dismiss, oh, these mad people on social media who use these weird names. It's much more difficult for them to dismiss a constituent who's actually writing to them with specific concerns that they have about their own sort of family or where they live. So that's really, really important. And in Scotland, I'm not sure if everybody realizes, we actually have 8 MSPs who represent us. Each of us are represented by a group of MSPs from different political parties, and so it's well worth writing your letter to all of them. For the most part, you get a sort of bread and butter response back, but you do get engagement with some of them, and it's interesting what they can say and what they can advise you to do.
I'd like to ask you now.
I think that's very important.
Sorry.
No, I just said that's really important. Personal contact is key. It really is.
Yeah, and if you're writing letters, don't use a template on its own. Take the template as an example of what you might want to talk about, but make it personal, tell them your story, and that makes it real for them. Whereas if you just copy out the template, it just goes in the bin. I've heard that being said by MPs, and they just don't appreciate that. But a personal story, a heartbreaking story, and they always are, because these are things that are really affecting women and children. And
also thanking them, thanking an MSP or an MP who has actually done something positive or raised this in Parliament or whatever. Write and thank them. People rarely get letters appraising what they're doing and thanking them, and that reinforces to them that this is something that is striking a chord and is being supported by their constituents.
Yeah,
I think that's really
I was talking to Baroness Jenkin the other week, and her husband, of course, did the speech during International Women's Day and supporting women, and she said he'd been overwhelmed by the response, all these letters coming from women going, thank you so much, and he hadn't expected that. But of course, and it happened with Joan, that her office was full of cards, and people noticed that. Yeah. People do notice that. But yeah, I think I can imagine it would be hard with a government minister, because they have to, but maybe also if you're speaking to a government minister, one thing that I thought, maybe go back to the Lorna Slater issue and say, is this appropriate, and can we trust a government that's allowing government ministers to do that? Because that's, even if it's a constituency, it's still an important thing that you're their if they're your constituency MSP and they are part of that cabinet, they have a collective responsibility. So they have a collective responsibility for tone.
And I think it's also, you're hearing, I think it's particularly from Labour MPs, you're hearing, oh, this never comes up at the doorstep. Well, if you've got evidence that you've been bringing it up on the doorstep in letters, then I think that's really important as well.
Can I ask you about the census? You mentioned that, Susan, in your presentation. And I know it was a year after, and I know that they've done something different. Fair Play tried to get a decision. Can you tell us a little bit about the knock-on effects of that?
Yes, I mean, this was quite an incredible situation, because that was the first time I gave evidence at committee. The committee looking at the census were very good, and they all recommended that they kept, because initially they talked about having 3 options for sex, but they recommended they had 2 options, and they also recommended that it should be in accordance with the law. And the National Records Office was really quite determined. I mean, we kept going back to them along with other groups, we kept presenting evidence, but they were really quite determined that they were not going to do this, that they wanted the sex question to be self-ID. Now, obviously, Fair Play brought their case against the ONS and won it. And the National Records Office in Scotland still didn't back down. So they ultimately then put them to court. I think we were all quite surprised that they didn't win that, because what it did was decouple data in Scotland and the rest of the UK. And that's not good anyway. So we now have a different standard. I don't know what the long-term implications of that are going to be. I feel, and I think many other people feel, that the NRS were expecting to lose that case, that they were probably hoping that they would look as though they were being progressive and doing what the government wanted, but then they were stopped from doing it by these awful women. I think it has probably created a bit of a headache for them, because it has undermined the quality of the data. Everyone knows it's undermined the quality of the data. It has been one more thing that has fed into a lack of enthusiasm for returning those census forms. So the other week it was reported that there were 1 million households who still hadn't returned a census form. And I think there's just over 2 million households in Scotland. So it's somewhere around about 45% of households haven't returned their census form, which is extraordinary. And there are a lot of women using it as the way, as Sarah will know from her work, as a kind of a contemporary protest, writing in believer in biology, writing in other things, filling it in upside down, putting stickers on them. And people asked for paper copies, which again, they were wanting to maximize online returns, and they were inundated with requests of paper copies. I don't think this is all because of us or all because of our concerns, but it is a factor in it. And it's been one more thing that has made this census process much harder for them. So it will be interesting. It's a bit of a shame we won't be around in 100 years to see all these census forms being opened, but I hope that grandchildren or great granddaughters will be able to go, oh look, my granny made a protest in 2022.
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating because, of course, in 1911, you had the suffragettes who boycotted the census entirely because they said, you know, I can't be a citizen if you won't let me have a vote. So I'm just not going to engage in this civic sort of operation. And 100 years later, we've got women who are trying to work out, not by boycotting it, perhaps, but by, as people have been pointing out, writing in their religion that they're a believer in biology, to make that point, to speak to the future, if not to the present day. But to sort of indicate their unhappiness with the decisions that have been made, which, you know, as Susan has said, means that the data we collect in Scotland is not going to be compatible and comparable to the data in the rest of the UK, which is so important. I mean, the census is about collecting data on which good decisions can be made about all sorts of things to do with government. It is not about expressing your personality in any way. That's not the whole point of it. The whole point is so that we make sure that the money that we have and that we spend on services goes to the right services. And that seems to have been completely forgotten, and it's become something that you can demonstrate your personality, your gender in.
Yeah. We've got a question from another member of the audience. If women are finding out, suddenly aware that what's going on, what will be the impact on the election if they don't vote? Have you any idea? Should we have a new party for women and children, defending women and children's rights?
Well, that's been tried, hasn't it? It was called the Women's Equality Party. And that doesn't seem to have really worked. No, I don't think we need new parties. Parties with first past the post and with the systems that we have, new parties don't work. What we have to do is perhaps take a leaf from what has happened with some of the smaller parties. It's possible to do sort of institutional capture. So maybe we need to be thinking carefully about how we do that in the future. But you know, although I didn't agree entirely with Julie Bindle's article a couple of days ago, which sort of celebrated, oh, the tide is turning, because of course it's not turning necessarily in Scotland. There is a sort of more sanity creeping back into the discussion. I hate to say how pleased I was to hear Boris Johnson say that, you know, the definition of a woman and women's sport should be for women only. But the fact that we have a prime minister now who has said it is a positive thing. And I think it is, you know, we're beginning to see some careful stepping back from Labour as well. So I would love to be able to say the tide is turning, but certainly the light that is being thrown on this, and possibly it's going to be more light that is thrown on after the GRA is passed in Scotland, and some of the legal difficulties and challenges that are going to come from that may well be positive for the UK as a whole.
Susan, do you have any thoughts on that?
One thing that I did say when I met with Shona Robertson was I do find it extraordinary, because the SNP are towards the start of a parliamentary term, and I think they have been told, and activists are telling them, that if they pass the GRA reform, this will all go away and women will shut up and be quiet. I don't think what they've realised is if they pass it, it will get worse and we will get louder, and more people will be aware of it, because there will be more stories in the press, there will be more Emily Bridges, there will be more Karen Whites. And I said, you are at the start of a parliamentary term. In a few years' time, just think where this could be, and just think how people will judge the politicians who push this forward. And I think maybe that's something to keep reminding MSPs, that they will need a re-election at some stage.
And yet they got re-elected last year. You know, even in the middle of all this ferment, people still voted for them. How do you account for that?
You know, they did, but one thing our polling shows, and obviously talked about how our polling shows the low support amongst political groups, it also shows that a lot of people still do not know what we're talking about, because there's a lot of obfuscation, especially around language. So there are still people who, if you talk about trans people, they think you're talking about transsexuals. They think they're talking about people they might have known, very, very rare, people who had got severe cases of gender dysphoria, had gone through full surgery and treatment. They are not aware that we are now talking about many, many times multiplied cohort of people, most of whom will have done nothing to change their appearance. They will not have had surgery. They, you know, there are chaps running around with beards and a bit of eyeliner saying they're now women, and that is not an exaggeration, because we all have seen examples of that. But I think because it is almost so extreme, a lot of people still don't believe that's happening, and they still think that we are just trying to be nasty for transsexuals, which was never any of our intention, and I don't think it's ever been anybody else's intention. It's when people really go into it and find out exactly what we're talking about and see it for themselves that they are horrified. But that message is building. It's still not there yet. There is still, you know, I would say probably almost half the people, when you poll them, have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah. Laura Cameron's got a comment question. Laura, do you want to ask your question, please? Laura Cameron, if you want me to ask it. Nope. Okay, well, she says captures happen by people taking up positions on committees, voluntary roles, etc., then pushing from within organisations. To turn the tide, people need to go for their positions themselves. Can you comment?
Well, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, we all know how sort of hellish and boring it can be to be the vice chair of some small committee attached to a school or something like that. And the thing is that the people who volunteer, to a certain extent, just immediately get onto these committees and can then push their own agendas. And so really, to a certain extent, the solution is in our own hands, that we do have to stand up, we do have to get involved in organizations and committees at a local and at a national level. You know, that's what we need to do, because there has been policy capture by people who are willing to get out there and do these things. And as Susan just mentioned, the fact is that we know who some of the new councillors are because nobody stood against them. So we have the situation that there won't be elections in some parts because there were only 3 or 4 people who even stood to be councillors, and that means that they've been shooed straight in. So you know, unless we're willing to stand up and be counted and to get involved, then that will keep happening.
Okay, I'm being told that the reason people still vote SNP is there's no effective alternative. Labour should have stepped up.
And we do get the message, Wheesht for Indy. You know, be quiet until we've got independence, and then we can sort out all of these issues and problems. But until we get independence, just keep quiet, no dissent, keep the party together.
I remember hearing that from black men telling black women not to create about their issues when in America they were struggling to get basic rights and votes. It's the same all over, isn't it?
It is, and it's you know, it's again, it's a foolish strategy for looking at it. You're looking at it from the perspective as an independence supporter, because what a lot of women who are formerly of the SNP are saying now is that because the SNP are so determined to push on with this, the main protection they have now is the Equality Act and how Westminster chooses to interpret it. And they are concerned that if that were devolved, or if Scotland got independence, then Nicola Sturgeon would, in her current frame of mind, rip it up and start again. So a lot of formerly independence supporting women are now saying they would not vote for independence purely because of this. And again, that's something that I'm not sure, with the exception of the Conservatives, parties have been exploiting, and it's really foolish for the other unionist parties, I think, to ignore that, because, you know, I would say those women, those SNP women, are probably to the left of politics. And I know there are more conservative SNPs, they were known as Tartan Tories, but those particular women would tend to have come from the left. So they would be more likely to find a natural political home in Labour or in the Lib Dems or in the Greens. And obviously the Greens are written off, and they support independence anyway. But they are without a political home, and they are without anybody else saying, yes, you can come to us and we'll try and support your interests instead.
What's the likelihood, based on the history of Scottish politics, of the Conservatives actually making an issue out of this and getting more support this time?
Well, I think they already are making an issue out of it. You've got, you know, very strong spokespeople like Murdo Fraser really pushing this and writing about it, and sort of really making an appeal to those politically homeless voters. So it is something that the Conservatives are really pushing, and they can see that it is an open goal for, you know, that they are being able to present themselves in a positive way as a defender of women's rights.
Yeah, we were offered a stall at the Conservative conference last month, and we were asked by one of the journalists, you know, would we have gone to any other political parties? And the thing is, yes, we would have done, but we got the funding and we got the opportunity. So, you know, it wasn't that we just decided to go to that one, but that they, you know, they are keen to take this forward now, because, well, I would hope because it's the right thing to do, but also because it is something that women are responding to. And the Conservatives were the only party when we had the demonstration at Holyrood who came out and spoke to people, and we got lots of pictures of that, and we put some of those up at the stall. And we had a very good fringe meeting, and it would be really good to be able to get meetings now that Parliament's open again, meetings in Parliament, and have MSPs from different parties. And even if they're not sure, just supporting and just saying, yes, let's have a conversation, let's support this, let's host this, even if I'm not convinced myself, because it would show a commitment to an open process. And so I think that maybe that's something else to push MS. Will you host this, even if you're not there yet? Just host it so you can hear different opinions, because that really is, as Andy said, when he went to that meeting because it was his job. It was his job as an MSP to listen to both sides.
Yeah, that's very fair-minded. I'm not sure anymore. I'm becoming very cynical how fair-minded our elected people are sometimes. Although I'm elected, so that includes me. Jackie Stoyle, who is a Lib Dem candidate and who knows what a woman is, has got a question for you. Jackie, do you want to undo?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yes.
Yeah, I really wonder if there was a campaign to say to Nicola Sturgeon, you know, I know SNP people here will be going, Jackie, yeah, that's right, you know, but say, I'm not going, I will vote no in the referendum if you pass your GRA bill. And, you know, she desperately wants it, not because she just wants it for its own sake, but because she wants to be the person to carry it through. And the whole thing with the Greens, and, you know, I think it would be a real shock. We have a situation in Inverclyde where we've got all sorts of things going on that you would think, if only the voters would give the MSP here a bit of a shock. Ferguson's is a national disgrace. We're a place of poverty, etc., etc. But whatever happens here, 19,500 people just walked out in the Scottish election and voted. Half the electorate voted SNP. So it's not about, I know that I'm not for independence, and you might go, oh yeah, you would say that. But the point is, there's no bloody no's. There's no wake-up call. It's as if you can do what you want. But on this issue, if you said that to her, I think she just might sit up and take notice. Be good if it was reflected in the council elections, although that, you know, so many other parties also have this policy. It's difficult to be able to sift through it. Because a lot of people probably think I follow the policy of my party, but on the two issues of prostitution and trans, I don't. So, you know, it's difficult to know.
And I'm sorry, Jackie, but I think I'm agreeing with all of the commenters who've just said, well, they're not convinced that Nicola Sturgeon actually wants independence. You know, I think she wants to lead the SNP, but that's a different thing. So I'm not completely convinced that that threat, which, you know, Women Won't Wheesht is all about, isn't really going to help.
Okay, fair enough.
I agree with that. I'm afraid. I think she would have cared more about some of those experienced women going off to Aldeburgh. I think she's not got much longer left, and she's decided this is going to be her legacy. I don't think she's really interested in much beyond that. She's probably, people think she's got probably looking to have a UN job lined up. You know, I don't know, having independence now at this stage, whether the economy could cope. I mean, is that the legacy she wants, to say, I'll push through an independence referendum, then walk away? I don't think she would want to do that. So I think this is her legacy.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. She wants to paint herself as this progressive politician. She's young. She's looking for the next career move. It's not necessarily going to be in Scotland. So, you know, I don't think independence really is that big a threat to her.
Okay, fair enough.
That's a shame. Iris, Iris has got a comment or question. Iris, would you care to ask your question? Iris is another one of our candidates who knows exactly what a woman is in Grampian.
Thank you very much, Alison. Sorry I was late in joining the call, but I just joined when you were speaking about Scotland having to be different, and in particular Nicola. And I firmly believe Scotland won't be independent. So with all the differences in policy between Scotland and the rest of the UK, you know, GRA, conversion therapy, even Women's Aid in England coming out with a statement which is totally different from Scotland's. What kind of country will we really be? And I suppose some of the work I've been doing in the last term, the last 5 years in Aberdeenshire Council, is getting all the wording on reports and equality assessments changed from gender to sex, which they should be. And my latest line of questioning is about data collection. So how, you know, my argument is, how can we fully fulfill our equality duties as councillors if we don't collect accurate data on each protected characteristic? So do you think we'll ever be able to prize the T away from the LGB so we can get accurate data collection?
Well, first of all, I just want to say that it is that kind of minutiae, that sort of detail, that is where this is going to be won. Not the big grand overall sweeping statements, but the going back and saying, but how does this apply to this particular clause in this particular document? That's what's really important.
Yeah, and the public sector equality duty is so important on that data collection, and I do know people who've been dogged with a bone about it within their institutions, and going back and saying, but if you don't get this, what will you do if you have a sex discrimination case? What will you do if this happens? What will you do if that happens? And just working away at it and making sure you've got all the stacks of evidence on the law. And I think that is, again, something that a lot of people can do, although it's fantastic that you're doing it within the council, because that's really critical. So many councils have abandoned that. And especially with the guidance that came out from the chief statistician, which was just all and in line with where they were heading on the census, but basically telling people they didn't need to collect data on sex, or even that it might not be lawful, which our QC Aidan did an opinion for Women's Place UK about the collection of data on sex and said, no, it is not illegal to collect data on sex. So having those sorts of pieces of information to hand will probably be very helpful in going forward with these things. But yeah, it is where the battles are going to be won.
Yeah, because let's face it, passing a bill and making it law does not necessarily mean it's workable, and we've seen that with this government before, whether it's the Named Persons Act or the football supporters, I can't remember the name of that act, but you know, this kind of lawmaking where it's done very quickly and it's not really thought through, and both sides of the arguments are not addressed, leads to unworkable law, and then eventually it has to be redone because it doesn't work. Quick law is bad law. Yes, exactly. Offensive behaviour at Football Act. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Well, look, I want to ask another question. It's because I don't understand. Most of you who are Scots will do that. Because the Scottish Parliament is unicameral, it's got one chamber. It doesn't have the Lords. Thank God for the Lords. I never thought I'd be saying that. But who does the revising in the Scottish Parliament?
So nobody, and that's that. In recent times, it's been the judges with the offensive behaviour at football and a named person, and now our JR. So it's an issue. When the Scottish Parliament was set up, there was a presumption that because it operated under a system of proportional representation, there would never be one party with a majority. And of course, you never plan for something that is never going to happen, because inevitably it will happen. And it did happen. And even though they've not quite got a majority, they've got the Greens, so they've got an effective majority. Committees are weighted according to the number of MSPs. So the SNP not only dominate the Parliament, they dominate the committees as well. And so what that has led to are committees that are potentially compromised because a bill has been introduced by the government and they are supposed to support it, and it is not getting the same sort of scrutiny that the Westminster committees give.
Okay, I get that now. So really, what you're revising, Chamber, is the inner court of the Court of Session. Is that right? Or is it the outer court? Okay, great. Sorry.
Sorry,
Sorry?
the highest court is the inner court of the House of Session is the highest court.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
Problem is that takes money, because then you have to have money to take these particular aspects of the law to court.
Yes, but when they're flagrantly mis-legislating, like the gender balance that you so brilliantly won, it obviously takes money, and it takes very expensive lawyers to do it, do a really good job. But then you get to kind of, the word comes down, doesn't it? Are they going to have to reform this act now, or repeal it? How will that work?
At our remedy hearing, what we asked was that they just struck this definition out. We did suggest they put in the Equality Act definition, but actually the judges decided that wasn't necessary, and I don't think it was particularly necessary, because I think it's quite important that we know that if the word woman appears in legislation, it refers back to the Equality Act without any without that being spelt out. So we have just said strike that out. They are claiming they might need primary legislation to do this. I don't know that they do, but I think that they have said they will they will send out advice that this is no longer lawful, this guidance. So there was a lot of chat when we brought this case that we wanted to get rid of this bill. I mean, this was how we were being portrayed, that we were these awful people who wanted to get rid of a piece of legislation designed to promote equality. And of course, we weren't. We just wanted this bit taken out, and that's what we've asked for in the remedy hearing.
Okay, I've got a question now. I'm sorry, because I'm ignorant, I'm asking ignorant questions. You have to forgive me. But even though the law is changed, or they have to change something, what guarantee is there that they will do this? Because, as you know better than I do, some jobs are for women only. So the job for which a particular person applied was designated as only for women. He got that job and then was promoted to chairing the Edinburgh Rape Crisis Centre. So nobody has stopped that from happening. Bearing that in mind, how can you get a remedy to that issue?
That is really difficult, and that is where, again, unfortunately, you almost need other people to bring cases, because, and this is where the Scottish government is really, really failing. This is where, as I'm saying about needing to ask politicians to take a lead and provide advice on this, because if nobody is prepared to enforce the laws, that job was advertised under Schedule 9 of the Equality Act. It is supposed to be a reserved job. One thing that I picked up recently, and very shockingly, going through some of the NHS guidance for transgender patients, is that many NHS boards in Scotland are completely misrepresenting that genuine occupational requirement. They are saying that when a person transitions, they can apply for a job in the gender they want to present in. This is completely not true. This is the opposite of what the genuine occupational requirement was supposed to do. And the groups who are advising on this know this, because they went to Westminster in 2015 and asked for that to be taken out, because they did not want trans people to be stopped from applying for a woman-only job if they were biologically male. So they know that, but they are now misrepresenting it. And this is the problem. There's, obviously you will all know, I would assume from the Stephen Nolan podcast, about the level of institutional capture, especially within Scottish government. And so it is these policies again. So anybody within the NHS, if you see one of these policies, please go and challenge it and say this is not lawful. And maybe at some point, if Rape Crisis Scotland had not been so captured, somebody might have said this is not a lawful application of this. But once somebody is in there, it is really, really hard unless somebody's prepared to bring a lawsuit. At some point, perhaps, a woman who is genuinely disadvantaged will be able to do this, and they won't have a leg to stand on legally. But until somebody does that, it's
what about
really
the discrimination that an ordinary man might find that he wasn't able to apply for this, and yet this other man has applied and been given the job? Now, is
yes,
it?
And actually, a man, if actually in some ways that's almost what you need. If you know that somebody's applying for that, you almost need to get a man to apply for it and then make a claim for discrimination. Because if they are letting some people who are legally male apply but not others, that is discrimination.
Yes, direct discrimination.
Yeah.
No, that's really great. I'm seeing lots of messages in the chat saying they'll crowdfund for you if you're going to do that. So, there's lots of willing volunteers here. A woman is bringing an individual lawsuit, says Margaret. That's great. Or is that in England? Not sure. Laura Cameron's got another question. As a special needs teacher who works with children who need intimate care, this really worries me. The stats for how many disabled women and children are victims of abuse are shocking. They truly are the most vulnerable in society. Comments?
Just complete agreement, really. What more can you say? And yes, it is those who are most vulnerable and who do not have voices for whom we need to speak. Going back to the suffragettes, they were actually campaigning for middle-class women to get the vote, not for all women to get the vote. But their argument was that then they could use that vote to ameliorate the situation for their sisters. And I suppose we are in that situation that if we can do something about it, if we can communicate with politicians, or we can challenge various things in small committees somewhere, that's what we ought to do to support all women.
And so, in a way, getting the vote in 1918 for older women, that was the wedge, wasn't it? In a similar sort of, yeah.
Absolutely, yes.
On the, I mean, just a little anecdote, but the woman who started the Women Won't Wheesht hashtag started it because she has a disabled daughter, and it was her big concern that she might not be able to get female carer for her daughter if this changed. So it's a very personal campaign for a lot of people, and that hashtag has gone worldwide is extraordinary, and it's testament to her determination as well.
It's brilliant. Is she part of For Women Scotland?
She is anonymous because of because of her daughter, essentially.
Of course.
So yeah, I mean, she comes to meetings and things, but yeah.
That's entirely understandable in light of all the things that are happening. Okay, I've just asked for people for the last few questions, but I've got a question in the meantime. Susan, what developments have you been most proud of? The ribbons, the slates, the feet, the shoes, the street stalls, the painted stones?
Well, I can't, and we can't take credit for most of those things, because so many of those things just came either from individual women or from local groups, and they grew up really organically. And this is what is really so wonderful about this, and has been wonderful to be a part of, the determination of so many people, and at whatever level. So I always say we're sort of doing the big policy stuff, or going to court and, you know, writing huge reports for the UN, and I'm quite good at that sort of thing. I would be absolutely useless, I think, standing on a stall in the rain in Aberdeen and talking to passers-by, partly because, you know, as I say all the time, I sound like the Queen, and but it's the women who have done those things, and the creativity and the energy. So I suppose I'm, in the sense that I'm proud to have been a part of something that maybe played a role in inspiring them to go out and do it, because actually, yeah, they are the beating heart of this, and they're incredible.
Yeah.
There's been an amazing resurgence of campaigning for women's rights over the last 5 years, throughout the whole of the UK, which is quite amazing. I mean, if you'd have told me 5 years ago that we could have over 100 women on a Monday night talking about women's rights for 2 hours, I wouldn't have believed you, but here we are. And we get these enormous amounts of engagements in discussions of the minutiae of law, for goodness sake, and people watching, whether it's Holyrood or House of Commons committees, and discussing them in enormous depth. We've all become so involved in the discussion of politics and feminism, and that must be a good thing.
That's true. Sarah, your next piece of research, is it going to be into the outcome of the elections, or?
I'm waiting to find out whether I get funding. I've applied for funding to do a supersize of my research into Scotland, to do it throughout the whole of the UK.
Whoa.
Looking at a women's cooperative constellation in the UK. So I am waiting to hear whether I get that funding. But if I do, then I'll be knocking on everybody's doors to talk to them.
Excellent. Well, we'll certainly publicise it for you. That'd be really great. And also, we've got to say thank you to the enlightened men who are part of this surge as well, because, you know, it isn't just a women's fight, although it mostly is. It's also men's fight, and men's with families and mothers and sisters and nieces, and also, you know, where it involves the homophobia, in fact, of claiming that people are same-gendered attracted, not same-sex attracted, as the Law Equality Act says. That affects lesbians and gays just as well as a lot of these other phenomena affect women in general. So I think we must say thanks, blokes, for stepping up.
No, definitely. And we have always said there's some people who, you know, when don't want men's voices, and we need men's voices. We need men's voices because men are as much a part of the decision-making processes, and they sit in Parliament, and we don't want any of them to feel they can't speak up about it, because it is going to affect everyone. So we do need everyone's voices.
I met a bloke on Saturday night. I went to the Oxford Feminist Union meeting, which about sports, fantastic meeting, and this chap was there. It was his first ever women's meeting. They're very brave of him to come along, and he understood straight away the impact on sport. Men get it, obviously, much quicker than some women do, the difference in sporting outcomes if you have males in female sport. So, you know, there are a lot more people willing to be convinced, and as I say, this particular chap got it straight away. And I think they're less likely to feel forced to be kind.
Yeah.
Have you got any comments on that?
It's there was an article, was it today or yesterday? I'm losing track of time, by Dominic Lawson about speaking up, and he pointed out something that a lot of other men have said, that when they say the same things as someone like Kathleen Stott or Julie Bindel or Joe Rowling, they do not get the same level of abuse. So, and he made an interesting point. He said it might be because men are more wary, and women are more wary about attacking a man. They're easier to attack a woman because you don't always think they'll have the capacity to retaliate. And I think that's true even if it's online and not in person, because men do tend to be more protected, they do tend to be more financially secure, all these structural things we know affect women. And he also said that it might also be because women saying no to males who want to identify their way into women's spaces and are saying no, they're setting boundaries, and this is a rejection, whereas men saying no, it's that they're not denying them anything in the same sort of way. So I thought that was quite pertinent, and so I think, yeah, it can be easier for men to say no. So please speak up. And I think I saw something, so before I forget, local groups, look for Scottish feminists, because they organise the local groups and they're brilliant at that.
Yeah, there was a really good comment in the chat there about that. Look, there's the at Scott _feminists for local groups. That's really great. Thank you, Verdi and Mary, for making those points. And Doreen, I just have to tell you, Doreen's a message here in chat that she's actually laid the floor whilst listening. So she's using multifunctioning is not a women's particular skill. Multitasking, that's really great. Look, I'm going to say thank you. It's almost 9 o'clock. The time has run by. I could listen to you all night long, absolutely. And I just want to say that it's been really great listening to you talking about all these things. Thank you, everybody, for all the questions, the comments, the live chat has been, helping us, feeding in some of the things we might have forgotten. Thank you, all of you, for joining in the conversation. I'd like to thank you for giving us your time, Sarah and Susan, and analysis this evening. To members of the audience, you may know that the website for Women Scotland is http://forwomen, all one word, .scot.scot. And Sarah Pedersen, again, her Twitter is @SarahPedersen2. Now, our next talk is on Monday, 9th of May, when I'll be talking to Claudia Clare, who's a ceramicist, about the cancel culture affecting women in arts. Do look out for the announcement or sign up to our website, liberalvoiceforwomen.org, just a straightforward title, and we'll send you the invitation as soon as it comes out. We also want to hear from you with any policy-related issues or problems that you want us to raise. Thanks to Jackie, our technical staff tonight, and Anna, the organizer of our Eventbrite Zoom meetings. And thanks to all of you for being part of a great event. And most of all to our wonderful speakers, Sarah Pedersen and Susan Smith, for talking to us about the fantastic impact of Scottish women who won't wheesht. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see if there's any more chat just before we leave. Uplifting in a sea of misogyny, says Nicola. Yeah, thank you. You do great. A lot saying thank you, and interesting and enlightening discussion. It's been another one of a great maybe one of our best sessions. Thank you, everybody, and good night.